Hello everyone, welcome and good morning. Thank you for tuning in. I know we're not doing a traditional critique today, but we're just having a little Q&A session. I know there was a lot of content this week and there's more coming. I just kind of wanted to trickle the content to you guys because it's a lot of video to watch and it's a lot of work to do, which is why I had grouped week 4 and 5 and give you guys week 5 kind of early. So coming up soon, you're going to get another 2 videos on painting the features, and they're just as long as painting out the whole face, but because they're the features, they're much more detailed and a little bit slower. So just bear with me, and I'm going to go ahead and catch up on some of the text that you guys have written already. Let me go up to the top. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm using a different mic this morning. I left my other one at the studio when I was filming, so I hope this one sounds okay. Okay, so Linda, I want to just start and I'll address your question here. So you said that you would paint it in the background too dark and too red-violet in the beginning, and then you covered it again, and will it dry enough to paint the skin tones today? Yes, and you know, mine was wet when I was painting, which is why I just painted a little bit around the head so I could still rest my arm on the canvas. Remember, you can always use a Mall stick if your background is wet or the hair is wet and you're trying to paint into the face. I just made my Mall stick out of a old curtain rod. You can also buy just like a wooden dowel and stick a wood ball on the end and glue it on the end, and then you've made your own Mall stick. They're really, really handy tools for steadying your hand, and I use them quite a bit when I go into painting the features because it's hard to kind of float your hand over the canvas and be really steady. So if your background is dry, continue working on your painting, Linda, just because there is so much work to do. Just use a Mall stick, or sometimes what I'll do is if it's kind of tacky but it's mostly dry, I will lay a sheet of transfer paper or that translucent vellum, and I'll just tape it so it doesn't smear. It'll lift some of the paint, but you can smooth that out later, but it gives you a chance to like kind of rest your hand on the background if you need it, if you don't have a Mall stick too. So the background, you know, when I first put in my first coat of background, it's not exactly the color that I want. I'll probably end up changing it later on, but one of the things that you kind of are going for is that average color. You can add texture and detail to your background. You could even change it into a setting or a landscape or something to that effect if you want. You can also make it darker or lighter. That's kind of up to you. Just remember that whatever you do to the background is going to influence a little bit of the skin tones where those planes start to turn away from us and, you know, recede into the space. And that's one of the ways we create the convincing atmosphere with our figure and integrate them into their environment. So your other question, I hope that answered your question. Your other question was, in the grisaille, do you just go on with the lesson and deal with the highlights later? Well, in the grisaille stage for this, so this is a little different. For those of you who took my tonal portrait class, we brought the grisaille to a complete finish and then did transparent glazes over the top. This is a slightly different technique in the sense that we don't bring our underpainting to a complete finish. You want a sense of resolve, and obviously you want the drawing in place and you want your overall value map to be there, but details are really unnecessary because what we do in this process is we build up the main form layers in like a very general sense in color, and we're using more opaque color. And then we'll build on top of that and on top of that in several layers to add highlights and details and different textures and adjust some of the tones a little bit. I mean, this is going to take probably 3 layers to or more to complete. So, and that's typically how I work. I work very general to specific, and sometimes I'll do a little bit more detail in the underpainting, but or not in the underpainting, but in the first color pass. But it really kind of depends on, you know, my working speed and you know, the process I feel is going to work best for the painting. So if you feel like your underpainting felt very kind of unfinished or didn't have the exact level of highlights and details that you usually would want to see, then you don't need to worry about it because it's going to get covered with this color layer. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, I'm catching up here. So Stella, you had said something about, is anyone else behind? So don't worry if you guys feel like you're a little bit behind. So the reason I broke the class up a little bit odd during these later weeks is because there is so much painting time, both for you guys to watch me do the process, but also for you guys to create on your, you know, block in your color. And, you know, this is kind of where a bulk of the work is done, is in this first color pass. All the other layers are going to be just kind of like noodling and refining very, very small amounts, you know, and adjusting like transitions and smoothing out and brightening and glazing. So it's, you know, most of your work is actually done in this layer, and it can take longer. And just because I managed to paint it in 2-3 hours of video does not mean I expect you guys to. You know, this could take you guys a week, it could take you longer, it depends on how experienced you are with painting as it is. Some people work very quickly and some work slower. So, you know, I'm kind of flexible in terms of, I mentioned this in one of the posts on the forum. If you guys are feeling like you're a little bit behind, do not rush this first pass. Take your time. If you can't get the features painted in this week and you can only get the major planes, then concentrate on that. Okay, I'm going to have a video coming probably in the next 2 days. I wanted to space it out so you guys weren't overwhelmed. But there will be one on painting the eye, the left eye and the nose, and then another one on the right eye and the mouth, because that's just kind of how I proceeded through the painting. And if you guys can't get to that by the time we have our critique next weekend, don't worry about it. Just get your main planes and like the background and the hair kind of roughed in, okay? So don't stress if you're feeling a little bit behind, because we can always extend our critique sessions if we need like an extra week. I'm pretty flexible on that. So I hope that gives you guys a little bit of a little breath where you can breathe a little bit and not stress so much about getting everything caught up. Life does happen, and I completely understand. And it takes a lot more time to actually do something the first time you're learning it. I use this process so often that it's pretty quick for me relatively. But I used to take, you know, several months on a painting, and now if I can dedicate my time to one piece, I can usually get it done in a month, for example. But, you know, I haven't always been able to paint that quickly, and a lot of that came down to learning to streamline my painting process and find a process that works for me. And so, you know, the first time you do it, it's going to be a little slow, but if you kind of continue practicing the same process, it will get quicker. Okay, so Colin, you had a question regarding model tonality. Can you go over what warm, cool undertones means? Yeah, okay, sure, absolutely. So the warm, cool undertones, it's kind of a difficult thing to describe in the sense of, you know, you can look at a model and think that they're cool if they're under cool light. So like a lot of times what you're trying to do is look at the model and see if they have, for example, if you look at the neck area, you'll typically see, because it doesn't have as much sun coloration, you'll see if they have more like of a cool blue, like in those halftones, or where you see like veins come to the surface, you'll usually see like more blues. Whereas someone who has a warmer undertone, you're going to see more green. There's going to be more of a yellow tint to it. You can have people who are darker skinned who also have warm dark skin and cool dark skin. It really kind of varies between individuals. So what I always like to do is look at those halftones, and that will tell you a lot about whether or not they have a warmer undertone or a cooler undertone. Another good area to look is underneath the eyes. I talk a little bit about this in the features video. There's a little bit more of a translucency to the skin right near the tear duct, but underneath the eye, still within the eye socket. The skin is very thin there. And what you'll see and you'll notice is that some people have more of a green tone, some people have more of a cool blue or a violet tone, and just kind of in those transparent areas. Another area to look is in, like, if you look at their overall, like in the face, just their overall tonality, you'll notice if someone has more of a yellow, which is what I consider warm, or more of like a pink, which I would consider cool, under overall tonality. So does that help clarify? So if I pull up our model's skin tone, she does have these peachy kind of colors in a few areas. However, let me see if I can bring in, I'm not sure if I have another reference of a different model, but if you look here, she does have like a kind of a warm tone here in that transition. But if you kind of look at the overall sense of her skin tones, you'll notice that she has a little bit more of the pink kind of dominant skin tone. And you'll notice, especially if you look down in here in the neck, it's kind of this cool blue-gray in those half-tone shades. Let me go back to one of my lectures. I think I might have a couple of different models in there. I believe it was this one here. So here's a good example. This was from the lecture on skin tones. So these are my nieces, and Lily on the left, she has very, very warm skin tone. And if you compare that to her sister, she has very cool skin tone. Not only is there a value difference between them, even if I lightened the reference, for example, on Lily, if I brought up the brightness, you can see how she kind of still retains that warmth. Let me try doing the curves here. Of course, it's going to brighten on the left or on the right side too, but you can see even when I make her much lighter, or I bring up her midtones, and she's under a cool light, but you can see she still has a very warm, kind of dominant halftone, especially if you look in this area right in here. There, let me pick a color we can see, like here in this halftone, and you'll notice that she has more of kind of this sense of like a yellow gray or a greenish tone. If you look down here in the neck, there's kind of that tone there. Part of that is the influence of the jacket. She has a lot of pink in her skin tone as well, but she just overall has a warmer feeling to her skin, and they're both shot under the same light. Whereas on the right side here, you'll notice that in these halftones, like right here, you have this very cool kind of gray. Under this eyelid here, you have more of that gray and a pink, kind of a purple, very subtle hue. If you look at these halftones, they're not very yellow. So that's what I tend to look for. If we were looking at a darker skinned model, like Vanna here, okay, she has overall a very warm undertone. Part of the difficulty with this image is the multiple light sources, and I talked about that. But if you kind of take an average, let me add a new layer here. So if you take like an average that isn't too influenced by either one, or you take a look at some of these halftones, you'll notice that she overall has this warm undertone despite having these cool pink highlights. okay, because that's the cool light influence. Here she has a yellowish highlight. That's that warm light coming in and filling in on this side. Now she has some cool tones in her lips. She has like these cool violets right in here. But you can see that she has a warm undertone. There's this almost olive skin tone right here. And you definitely see it like in these middle sections or these neutral sections here. And she definitely has like a warm tonality out here that you can see, even across the arm this way. Obviously this part of her is more tan, and she has more of a pale value near the chest, which didn't get as much sunlight. But even look at that color there. That is a very, very warm tone. So there's always the color zones of the face to take into account too. But when I'm looking for that average tonality, I'm trying to find what skin tone kind of looks like the model overall. And it can be a little bit tricky to determine because we have all these other influences that we're thinking about. We're thinking about the temperature of the light source. We're thinking about, you know, the directional light, or if is it more diffused. Plus we're thinking about color zones of the face, you know, the red zone, we have that red zone, and then we have, you know, the blue-gray zone. The cool zone is in the lower half of the face here. Let me grab a thicker pen so you can see where I'm drawing. So like we have the cool zone here. So you can see that this tone actually feels a little cooler than what we might have in these upper zones. We have the red zone in here. And while it may not seem that obvious on her, you can see a little bit more of a pinkish tint here. You see a little more of the pink influencing the highlights in these areas. And you see a little bit more rosiness to the skin here, and a little bit in the chin, especially if you compared it to other areas like here. So let's actually take a quick example of that. Let me grab a simple paintbrush. So if we took the color in the nose, something around there, we have that color there. Then we have that in the cheek. Let's compare that to what we see here. It's a subtle difference. The values are very close, but you see how that bottom one has a little bit more of a green. Over here in the light, it's a little more gray. And it's a little cooler. And so these are all from that lower cool zone. And so these are from that cool zone. Let me grab a pen here. That's the cool zone of the lower half of the face. And then these are from that warm zone. And it's a subtle difference, but you can see a little bit more of that red influence. And of course, in her lips, she has a very strong pink color. We have like a very kind of berry tone, but she also has this cooler upper lip. And you will see that in models with darker complexion. You'll see a few of those cooler zones like in the lips occasionally. So her bottom lip is very warm and even has that hotter pink towards the center. And as the skin moves out, it gets a little bit cooler and a little more purple. There's some beautiful colors in there. And even if you looked in the eyelids, she has a little bit of that kind of cool tone. Now I know she has a little bit of makeup on, but if you look in some of these inner corners, you see these cool kind of tones, but then it gets very warm underneath. So I hope that helped clarify a little bit. So Tammy, your question is, you don't understand why the shadows are opposite of the light source in terms of temperature. Yeah, I can explain. So let's let me go back to nope, that's not our lecture video. Let's see. Oh, here we are. Okay. So I'm going to just do a little color theory example here. So let me just draw two spheres. Okay. I wish it was as easy to draw. Oh, that one's more of an ellipse. Wish it was that easy to draw a perfect circle. Okay, so let's say we have our shadow edge somewhere right around here. So we're just gonna have the light source come from the right in that general direction. But let's say this light source is a warm and this is a cool. And this is a great experiment for all of you to do. You can just take an egg and buy some colored bulbs. Okay, and you can buy you could even just buy a warm and a cool bulb. But if you want to explore this kind of further, buy like two complementary colors. Buy like a red bulb and a green bulb. You can buy them at the hardware store if you just go to the light bulb section. They'll have like the colored bulbs that are, you know, for kids to put in their bedrooms, and you can use these to light still lifes and get really interesting effects. But you could use color gels, like I had mentioned. Those are those transparent films that go in front of your light and it'll tint the color of the light. But if you have a warm light source, okay, I'm going to just say, let's do the red light source, okay? We're going to have a red light on this sphere. We're going to have a green light on the other one. You will see that red go darker, just like you normally would, right? You might have a highlight. And usually with a red bulb, your highlight's actually very, very saturated. Let's go a little bit. Okay, so in your shadow, the shadows always contain a little bit of the complementary color of whatever that directional light is. So in this example, we're going to go in with a green, but usually it's obviously not a light green, it's a dark green, and it's usually a little bit more muted of a color. So it might not be a pure saturated green, but it will be something like that. And there might be a little bit of that red influence here kind of spilling over into that as well, but you will always have a little bit of that opposite light. So if we had the opposite effect, our light source was green, and this is a great experiment just to do in general, because when you put this red light on there, you will see these colors. It might sound crazy, but you will see them. A lot more obvious than these warm, cool lights that we talk about, which are more subtle. So let's say we have this green light lighting the object. You'll have a darker green midtone. That's usually where you see your main value of the object is usually in these lighter to mid tones. Okay, and then as you start to get, you'll get sometimes a little more of a saturated version of that light source color. Now mind you, this is on a white object, and white objects are subject to their environment very, very much. So we're not thinking about a red apple or a green apple, though that could work as well. But let's just stick with the concept that these are white objects with a directional colored light. So now we're going to go into the red zone for our shadow. and it's probably going to be a little less saturated. So it's that there is a little bit of the complementary color in, let's go a little more saturated with that. Maybe a little bit more. So they're muted versions of those colors, but you can see how it gives a more realistic effect rather than using a green for that shadow. So I'll show you what that would look like. If we took a green shadow, it's kind of boring. It needs a little bit of that red. You might have a little bit of green in there, maybe breaking up some of that form. If this were like a green apple, for example, and we had a little bit of light bouncing back into that shadow, you might see a little bit of a green reflected light, but that core shadow would have a little bit more warmth to it. Same goes for this one. You might have a little bit of red reflecting into that shadow, but look how much more interesting that is than if everything was painted kind of in the same color zone. So if we took the same concept, but we're talking about more subtle light. So let's say our light source is sunlight on a white object. Our light is going to be kind of yellow influenced. We'll have a nice kind of more brilliant yellow, but it's going to be a little more muted as it goes towards that shadow. Bring the value down for the next step. All right, so it's still in that yellow zone. But now when we move into the shadow, what you'll notice is, and you'll see this in great examples if you're ever out on the beach or in a kind of a open environment, let's say, and you're at the time of the golden hour, which is when the sun is setting. If you look at the sunlight, it's very warm because that light is kind of filtering through all this atmosphere. And then when it hits the model, you're going to have that really warm light. But if you look at their shadows, there's a fill light kind of influencing that shadow side, and that's the sky, which is still slightly illuminated from the sun. But it's going to reflect those blue cool tones. And Joaquin Sorolla painted these kind of scenes on the beach very, very often. And if you look at his color use, he always, in these warm light situations, uses really exaggerated cools. They might be cool greens to cool blues to cool violets, but they're all cool compared to the lights. And usually it's complementary of whatever that light source was. So the complement of yellow is violet. So, and a complement, for those of you who might not know, is the opposite color on the color wheel. So whether it's a red violet or a blue violet can depend on several factors. The environment, what's creating that fill kind of in the shadow, how warm or orange. If your yellow light is more orange, then you might have more of a blue violet, because blue is, the opposite of orange. Whereas if you have more of maybe like a lemon yellow, you might have more of a neutral kind of violet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take this color, but I'm going to make it a little bit more neutral. And let's see how this works. Yeah, that's going to be a nice kind of core shadow color. Okay, and sometimes what can confuse the eye is that we might have a little bit of a warm reflected light. So let's say our light is hitting this surface here and bouncing back into that shadow. Let's go ahead and put in a darker cast shadow. All right. Well, we might have a little bit of a reflected light in there. And remember, the reflected light is usually a little bit darker than your darkest midtone, which is right in here. So I'm going to pull that down just a little bit and bring a little illumination back in there with a touch of yellow. And you can see how that kind of feels like a warm light, like sunlight, hitting a white object and turning over the form. And it's much more exciting visually than if we had just used like a darker yellow. So if I did that, for example, let's go ahead and go back to our yellow, and we just brought our yellow down, which as you darken yellow, it gets a little more gray. But if instead of that purple, we went with this, it can work, but it's kind of icky. It's not as exciting. You can have situations where that is the case, but it depends on kind of the environment. And that would also indicate a yellow object more. So if we were painting a lemon, you might see more of this color than the purple, but that purple is still going to be in there just a little bit. Okay? So it might be something more like that if you were painting a yellow object. So if we were painting the opposite light source, so let's say a cool light source. A cool light source would be like natural daylight, indirect light, so the sky blue, north-facing windows. So here we have this cool light source. And I'm trying to push the extremes of these just so I'm illustrating the concept a little more accurately. Let's bring the value down here for a darker halftone there. Okay, so now we're starting to transition into a shadow. So we want our shadow to be slightly warmer. And the opposite of blue is yellow. So we're going to pull this over. And I'm going to bring that down. Maybe I'll push it over. Maybe just a little bit more. I think that's too yellow. I think I want to go a little more yellow-red. It would be easier if I had the actual egg in front of me with the light source on, because then you can kind of make those judgment calls. And a lot of painting is knowing what to look for. So some of these concepts in illustration might be more obvious, like what I'm doing here. But in real life, you want to look for these influences. They might be more subtle than this. You know, you might have a lighter object like this, where it's not as saturated, or your light source is maybe somewhere in between these where it's more neutral. But in a lot of cases, if you just know what you're looking for, it becomes a lot easier to kind of influence your colors and know what direction you're headed. So there we have two examples of a warm versus a cool light source. And even though our model, when we look at our model, we have these skin tones to take into account as well. When you look at the highlights, they are very cool pink with a slight blue influence when you see them in the right color zones, like right here, this highlight color under that eye. I would definitely call those cool compared to a warmer skin tone, which might have more yellow in it. So those belong more in this family down here. Okay, and remember, you're always comparing the light to the shadow. So if you're not sure what your light source is, if you're not sure if it's warm or cool, you have to ask yourself, compared to the lights, what is the shadow? So let me go back to my oil sketch brush. There's our shadow. And while it's quite dark, if we go in here, we see a lighter version of that. So when you see those two next to each other, you have to ask yourself, here's our shadow, here's our light. Which one is warmer? It's pretty clear that this is. So we know our light source is cool. And our shadows are warm. And so we know that this is more of the scenario that we're going, this is more of the scenario that we're going to be looking for. And we know that this light source is going to be more influential. Now, my light source was not this blue. It was a little bit more neutral than that. But it's the concept. It's like understanding the planes helps you when you're looking at the model, not because we see all these literal planes, you know, on the face. It's they do exist, especially some of the major planes, like we have here. We can follow that plane for that shadow shape. But some of the more subtle planes, you know, they're not as rigid, but understanding the concept helps us define and understand and conceptualize what we're looking at. Or else we just look at these areas and we have no way to kind of grasp them. So a lot of these concepts, you know, they help us understand a little bit more and analyze when you're feeling stuck. You know, they help you analyze and make decisions for your painting. And it also helps because sometimes you don't want to copy the photo. You might want to exaggerate the effect of the light for mood, you know, for the purpose of creating mood in your painting. So it gives you more freedom as an artist to take artistic license and to develop your painting in a direction that, you know, maybe is not exactly a copy of the photo. So, and you can also use, we're very lucky in terms of technology now that we can manipulate our photos. Let me get down to, yeah, I'm on that photo. So let's just say we want to play with the light source. Make it more of a scenario that we see there in the egg. Actually, let's go opposite. That'll be fun. It looks really wacky, but let's go a little more red, a little more yellow in the lights. Okay, and in the shadows, we're going to go a little more blue-violet. You know, it looks kind of garish, but the idea is that you could play around with, you know, color as a way to kind of express and take artistic license and add mood and change the feeling in your painting. You can experiment with that. Sometimes what I'm doing is just a very subtle version of that. I might say, maybe I want to sense a little bit more yellow, or maybe I want to sense a little more of that cool light, because you know, color does influence our mood and the mood for a painting, and so it depends on the color, what's called a color gamut. A color gamut is basically choosing a color range to work with. So you might be wanting to work in a generally cool color range, and so you want to keep the whole, let's say the whole thing feeling cool, but even within that, what we would consider cool, you might have warmer and cooler colors compared to each other, but maybe overall the influence is cool. There's a good book that talks a little bit about color gamuts. It's Color and Light by James Gurney. It's an excellent book. It goes a lot more in depth into some of these concepts, but also into the idea of using a color gamut to choose, you know, what color you might do your painting in. For example, doing a nocturne is going to be in a whole different color set. There's going to be overall cooler colors, but you might have warms and cools within that. There's always going to be warms and cools. If you just painted a nocturne in blues and there was no temperature difference between the blues that you were using, It'd be a very boring painting and it would just look monochromatic. So how you keep something from feeling monochromatic is by using that complementary idea of warm and cool. Does that make sense? I know it was a long explanation, but I hope that illustration helped everyone. And if you have, it doesn't have to be during this class, but if you have some extra time, take an egg, or you can even take a colored object. A good experiment after you do the egg object with a warm and a cool light source or a colored light, try taking a colored object. Take a green apple and put a red light on it. Some really weird things happen. But it's a great exercise, and it's something when I'm teaching color theory, it's an exercise I have students do because it totally it's hard to look at for too long, but it will completely change the way you understand color. Green apple, red light. Or you can even take a green apple, put it under a warm light versus a cool light, and paint that same object under two different light sources, and you will understand these concepts much more clearly. So Susan, your question. With my work, do I skip separating the painting into the light and dark and just go straight into color after you transfer? Oh, okay. I always do an underpainting. I over the years as I've kind of refined my process, I used to do a full grisaille, like what we did in the tonal course. I used to do a full closed finished grisaille, which, I felt it was necessary back then because I was still learning. I'm still learning today, but I was, I kind of used, it was my my kind of lifeline for getting the drawing right and making sure I had full control of my values. But over time, I felt like it was almost too time consuming for me, and later became kind of unnecessary. But I still use this underpainting process for a few reasons. And the one I've kind of done now and what I'm teaching in this class is that abbreviated version where we're just doing the glazing and the scumbling, and then you kind of do one, maybe two passes, and then you're ready to move into your color. The reason I kind of abbreviated that is partly because it's quicker, but also it's kind of unnecessary to have a finished underpainting in that sense, in like the full closed grisaille finished rendering. It's more about having that value map and doing most of the work in the color layer. If you find doing a finished closed grisaille is beneficial to you, then by all means do one, because it can be very useful in terms of learning, and and it depends on if I'm doing like a master copy and they were known to do a closed grisaille like Ang, then I would recommend doing something like that. But for me, it was just an efficiency thing. But I still use the underpainting because there's a few reasons. Because of the way I transfer, or even when I'm drawing directly on my panel, you have to seal your lines and such. But I don't want them to strike through my color layers over time. So over time, oil paint dries and cures, it becomes more transparent. So you might have seen this in like a museum looking at a painting. You'll see these lines kind of poke through where you can see their drawing or maybe where they had changed their painting. And that's because oil dries a little bit more transparent over time. So by having this underpainting, what it's going to do is as that color layer becomes more transparent, you have this luminous, drawing essentially, this underpainting that's going to start to influence those upper layers. And so it's going to get more luminous in the lights with time because that white underpainting is going to start showing through, and the darks are going to get richer because we have that warm, transparent dark. So it actually helps your painting age in that sense. And I'd never thought of it that way until the concept of that was introduced to me by Adrian. And it's very true. I've seen it actually with some of my older pieces. As just over a couple of years, I might go to a collector's home or see a piece I'd painted years ago, and I can actually see before I did the underpaintings where my drawing was striking through. So it kind of helps with that, but it also helps the luminosity of your painting. Yeah. So Susan, there are artists like Scott Waddell who do a more direct, and they do a process called form painting, and that's where he's like finishing detailed forms as he's moving down. That was a technique that was more taught by, I'm forgetting the name, Anthony Ryder. He teaches form painting, and also I think where Scott studied was back east at Grand Central, I believe. They use a technique, underpainting technique called ébauche, E-B-A. Here, let me write it down. I think it's called E-B-A-U-C-H-E. It's a French term. I don't know the exact translation, but if you go to the Underpaintings blog, there's actually a good article on, it was years ago, so you might have to search for it. But they talked about the technique, and that was a technique used by artists like Bouguereau, Gérôme, and a lot of the French academic painters. Yes. So, so that technique is where you you do your underpainting, but you do it in color. And it's usually like a slightly less chromatic, but it's kind of a wash. The way we do our wash in the grisaille stage, or the scumbling and glazing stage, you do that instead in a color, like a muted color palette, almost like dead color layer. I actually haven't used that technique. For me, I don't see much point in using color in that first underpainting if your goal, and also I noticed with the ébauche, they always tend to end up dark. So it would kind of counterbalance that concept of wanting your painting to grow more luminous with time. I noticed that the ébauche is a lot of times very, very kind of dark, and then they build their lights on top. I find that it might throw off my value map a little bit. I like having that monochromatic underpainting and then jumping into color on top. But that's just how, I've developed my process over time. I always recommend that everyone go out and learn all the different techniques they can, and then you kind of take everything you've learned and mash it together and pull what works for you, and get rid of what doesn't work for you. That's kind of what I did. I studied both direct painting, alla prima, all the way to more classical approach where you did the full closed grisaille, to more of the approach I'm using now, which is kind of a mashup of all of those. Some of it I use, more of the direct technique when we're doing our first color pass. That's very much like a wet into wet direct technique. The indirect part of it is that we have an underpainting and then we go back over it with multiple layers once each layer dries. So technically it's an indirect process, but it kind of employs a lot of the other, techniques that I've learned. So another question, Colin, color paint management. So when you start painting, how much do you aim to map onto your palette? Obviously you wouldn't put every tone down. Yeah. So there's a few ways I set up my palette, and it kind of depends on the painting. The one technique that I'm showing you is basically I start by mixing my shadows, then I mix my average lights, and then I mix in between. And I try to find those average tones. And let's just say for structure, I have 3 shadow values, 3 mid-tone cools, 3 mid-tone warms or lights, for example, like the pinks. And then I might have 1 or 2 highlight colors, or 3 different highlight colors, the yellow, the pink, and the blue highlight color. So, you might have 10 mixtures, 10 to 12. It depends. Sometimes I'll find myself needing a color, and you'll see this in some of the demo. I don't have that color mixed up, and so I ended up needing more of it because I end up using it more often, not realizing it until I'm getting into the painting process. And so I might end up mixing another color as I'm working. But typically aim for 2 to 3 shadows, 2 to 3 cool midtones, cool to 3 warm midtones, and then 2 to 3 lights or highlights. And that should give you more than, and then of course I have my accent colors for the color zones on the face. I have the pinks for the lips and the cheeks and the nose. I have or I like to pull in like colors, almost like you see in here, these exaggerated cool tones. So I might mix in a couple of purples, a couple of more blues that are more intense. That way I can just pull from them when I feel like it's necessary in order to make the painting more exciting. Does that make sense? And then your question, Colin, again, was do you work out from the darkest dark, the lightest light to find a midtone? That's kind of, it can be useful to do that. You know, it depends on the color range. Not every painting you do is going to have as strong of a contrast as what we have here in our photo reference. Here we go from darkest black to almost near white. So you might have, for example, something that's more in like this range, or you might have something that maybe doesn't get this bright for your painting. So it kind of depends on the range that you are establishing, you know, the key, what we call the key that you're establishing for your painting. This, for example, is not as, this is a little more high key, but if we take into account that, it's maybe more of a full range. I personally love high contrast. It's kind of one of my defining style or aspects of my style. I love that strong contrast of light. So that's just something, you know, I tend to work with, but it doesn't mean I always have this blackest black in my painting. It just kind of depends on the piece that I'm working on. But if it helps you to create that key, so like let's say you want to set the key for your painting, you mix up your lightest value and you mix up your darkest value, let's say it's here, then yes, it will be easier for you to find something in the middle. And then you can work out in those directions. But you don't want to forget that colors change from warm to cool overall. And then usually what happens is if you have a warm shadow, you're going to have a cool transition. Then you might have a warm again in like, let's say where it starts to turn into the flesh tone. And then it'll pick up cool again towards the highlight. So you have a warm, cool kind of pattern that you're looking at over the form. Okay, so hold on, I got to scroll back up and catch up with some of the other comments here. Stella, you said I mentioned Adrian. He teaches something kind of similar, but he kind of has his own technique. But when I studied with him, he was teaching Verdaccio. He doesn't teach that anymore. I don't even think he uses it very much in his work, but he used to more often. And that was where you painted your portrait in a series of greens and violets, kind of pinks, and then you glazed your yellows at the end. But I'm not sure exactly what he's teaching now, but he does have a Patreon account where he's been posting some tutorials and that sort of thing. If you want to check out what he's offering, just go to his Instagram, and I think he has a link in there. His technique is, I would say, a little bit looser, and in the sense, like he does use the tiling that we talk about, but he leaves his tiles a little bit more obvious, and his color palette's slightly different than what I do. But a lot of my influence, yes, in the sense that like his underpainting technique is very similar to what we're doing. He brings his to more of a finish, and sometimes he does those as just a finished painting in itself, like these monochromatic paintings. Okay, so Susan, let me catch up with your question. So you're saying, I suppose with the method you're teaching, that would help if there are colors you have used that fade. So do you mean like because alizarin fades? I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but I think you're saying, is it beneficial to use some of those colors because they become more transparent? I actually try to avoid any colors that are known to fade. The weird thing about alizarin crimson, and you might have seen this occasionally if you go into like a museum, I've seen a few paintings where you could tell that the fabric that they were painting used to be a really intense red, but like a kind of a deeper red. And now it looks gray in certain areas, like especially in the shadows. That's because they glazed with a color alizarin and it completely fades. So if you had a grisaille and you only glazed with alizarin over it, give it a 50 to 100 years and you're painting maybe even sooner if it's exposed to direct sunlight, you would just see your underpainting. I mean, it would just be this weird kind of purpley gray. So yeah, I try to avoid a color like that. I use a substitute for alizarin ever since I found out that alizarin was not permanent. So I try to use all my colors with a light fastness rating of 1, which is the top, light fastness, the best rating you can get. So Colin, you said you work out. Oh, I just answered your question. Sorry, I'm catching up here. Linda, I know you said you've been listening and then you signed in a little bit late. You should be able to go back and listen if you missed out on a part of the video. Okay. Tammy, you said you love working on a drawing by the star grid, but you've heard of many other instructors say that it's just a crutch. Yeah, a grid can become a crutch. And I kind of talk about sight size as the same crutch. Some artists have learned only sight size technique for drawing, and they cannot for the life of them draw comparative measurement. And so when something prevents you from being able to kind of move forward and use various approaches to your work, I consider it a crutch. The grid can be helpful. I don't always use it. But I do use it on occasion, especially when I have a complex composition. And for me, it's more about composition, but it can be really useful for helping you get an accurate drawing quickly. However, grids aren't practical for drawing from life, so I always say that you should be as well-rounded as you can in terms of approaches and techniques, so that way you can, kind of hone in and decide how you want to work. I use the grid in a class like this because it's much easier for everyone to get a pretty solid drawing, and also it makes it easier for me to critique in the beginning stages, to look at your drawing and see what's off, because I can refer back to that grid. And also helps you guys with scale, making sure you have a good proportional composition for your painting. So there's a few reasons I use it, but I would say try not to become too reliant on any single, thing like a grid, or using only sight size technique and only working from photographs. You want to try and round yourself out as an artist, and so practice drawing and painting from life. Practice working from photographs, because working from life isn't always practical. And I know some purists who say you should never ever work from photographs, but the truth is, if you've learned a lot from painting from life, working from photographs is you kind of learn what the limitations are of photography, and if you understand concepts like this, then it won't matter if you're working from photographs, because you can influence and make artistic decisions about your painting. You can influence like the color zones of the face, for example. You can accentuate them. You could also change the color gamut of your painting. There's a lot of creativity that you can still bring in. And if anyone wants to criticize working from photographs, just look at artists like Andrew Loomis, look at artists like Norman Rockwell. Some of the greatest illustrators, they all worked from photographs. And they were phenomenal painters and great storytellers. So, I think it's just a little bit of a kind of a kickback from traditional painting. You get a lot of this in the atelier system. And, what I do agree with is that you should learn from life as much as possible. I can always tell when someone's only ever painted from photographs because there's a level of flatness, and a lot of it comes down to edges and color or value. So, but a lot of times it's those sharp edges that photographs tend to give us. And so by studying from life, we learn about seeing edges and taking things from three-dimensional to two-dimensional. So it just requires a different part of the mind, and it will make you more well-rounded as an artist. It's much harder to work from life than it is to work from a photograph. So, the way I tend to think of things like grids or working from photos, because some people will say that's a crutch, is just to not become too reliant on it, especially as you're learning, but then use what works for you. So if you don't like the grid, then don't utilize it. I use it on occasion. Sometimes I don't use it at all. Actually, I'd say most of the time I don't use it. I usually often use it when I'm working really large and I need to keep distortion in mind for like my figure, making sure when I'm standing up close to my painting, distortion isn't having an influence. And it also helps me when I'm working on like commissions, when I need that 100% likeness, then I will use a slightly tighter grid, or I'll use that star grid, and that helps me with that too. So, or if I have a multi-figure composition, I'll use it on a broader scale for establishing placement and keeping things kind of compositionally balanced according to my preliminary sketches. So it's all of that kind of combined. I hope that helped you a little bit. I don't consider it cheating because you still have to do the drawing. And like I said, there's many ways to create. You'd be surprised at how many artists just transfer the photo. And, if it works for you, then I'm not going to judge you. But personally, I think to be a well-rounded artist, you should practice all of it. Life drawing, drawing from photos, learn sight size. It's really valuable. It's really valuable to train your eye to see more accurately. And it's a great technique in being patient with measuring, but don't make it the only thing that you learn, because then it becomes a crutch. Okay, so let me move forward with the questions. Colin, so what stage do you consider the background other than a general tone? In my personal work, I often paint the background first. If I'm not sure what I want the background to be, then I will just apply a general tone, and then as I develop the portrait, maybe after the first pass, I might revisit the background, especially if I'm going to be making a drastic change. Then in my second layer, I might do my second pass on the background and get it closer to what I want, and then move forward and refine in each pass. Okay, Linda. Let's see. You had a question about background not dry. Oh yeah, I did answer your question at the very beginning, but you might have clicked out. If your background isn't dry, then try using a mahl stick to float your hand over. And if it takes, if it's a little bit tacky and you can rest your hand on it without it completely getting all over your hand, then you can continue to work on the face. It doesn't have to be 100% dry. Mine was a little bit tacky when I went back in and painted the features. I might have smeared a little bit, but it's an easy enough area to fix. So try not to stress too much about it. And you can always use a mahl stick or a wooden dowel, or even like a cane works good if you hook it over the edge of your easel to float your hand. You could also, if it's kind of slightly tacky and you don't want it to get on your hand, you can just take a sheet of vellum and just carefully tape it over the spot where you want to rest your hand, and it won't smear the painting as much as you rest your hand there. And then no highlights in the hair. Don't worry about that. We're going to be adding highlights and brightening up the lights of the hair in layers. So just put in the darks for now. Well, thank you, Colin. I'm glad. Yeah, it's, Tammy and Colin, the whole question about, you know, certain things. Everyone in the art world is very opinionated on these kind of things, and you have different schools of thought. But like anything, some people think you should never use black on your palette. They say, "Oh no, you should never have, a black color on your palette, like ivory black." But one of the techniques in one of the workshops I offer is the Zorn palette, which uses ivory black instead of a blue. And it's perfectly fine because a lot of the old masters used ivory or bone black. So, you know, it's just and that's one of those rules that kind of came out of Impressionism when they were trying to paint outdoor light. Of course, you wouldn't want to use black in the outdoor light, but if for some reason it became kind of part of this kind of art culture where, oh, you should never use black, it's a crutch. Well, black can be kind of boring in terms of a color. I usually never use it just straight out of the tube, but I rarely use any color straight out of the tube. I'm always mixing, a specific color that I need. So, and some people might consider an underpainting a crutch. I don't know. I've never heard anyone saying that, but actually, I think I have. There's a couple of artists who their approach, they don't even do a drawing. They just start painting, and they think doing any kind of drawing is going to lock you in too early and disrupt your creative process, and they think it's a crutch. Well, to each his own. I couldn't start a painting without having a drawing. That's just the way I think. It's the way my mind works, and it's what gives me the best results. And I think that's, in the end, what matters the most is what gives you the best results and what, tools you have in your toolbox as an artist. I learned a lot of different techniques. I feel like it made me a well-rounded artist in general. I still learn more techniques. I'm never done learning. I take workshops and, I follow processes and stuff, and I might not end up using them in my practice, but it still helps me. It challenges me and keeps me from getting too comfortable in my box. So I think like learning a new medium is a great way to get outside of your comfort zone. It's frustrating, but jumping in and trying to learn watercolor was super frustrating for me because I'm always thinking like an oil painter. But I had to learn to kind of be a little more free with my painting for watercolor, and I ended up loving it. And I still do it just for fun. I don't use it for like my finished work, but I still have fun with it. And that's kind of the key, is to just keep pushing your language and your skill set, even if you don't plan to do it as part of maybe your gallery work. I like to do silver point drawing or copper point. It's really, really tedious, but I love to do it. I would like to learn egg tempera, so I have and pastel, and a lot of times you'll find yourself, if you've done a lot of oil painting, sometimes there are these translations into other mediums that work. But it's about kind of just widening the breadth of your knowledge and your skill set, but also always challenging yourself. Yeah, Stella, the Zorn palette's a great one to start with. And that's what when I first started painting, I was self-taught for a really long time, which is really hard. I just learned out of books and whatever I could get my hands on before I started getting formal painting classes. And when I finally took my first class, it was with Aaron Westerberg. It was a alla prima figure painting. And I had my 20 colors on my palette, everything from cadmium yellow to, phthalo blue. And he just said, you have too many colors and you need to reduce it down to help you understand color theory a little better. So he had me start with the Zorn palette. And he said, try working with it for a year and then start expanding outside of it. And that's what I did. And it totally changed the way I understood color. So it's one of the reasons I teach it, because it's a great process to kind of teach yourself to work with a limited palette. You can't mix every color that you see. It is limited for a reason, but it teaches you to have control over value, chroma, and also just how to be creative and, mix the colors that you need. Colin, I haven't done an online class with limited colors. I actually plan to do one. I'll be filming it here in the next couple of months, and I'll probably release it later this year. But I will be offering a workshop, a 2-day workshop in Los Gatos at the New Museum. It's NUMU, N-U-M-U. So let me write that down. And Los Gatos, California. That's up near the Bay Area. And so I'll be doing a 2-day Zorn palette workshop where we do my color chart based on the Zorn palette, and then we do a small master copy color study, kind of like the tiled version of our color study for our painting that we did, but we do one of a master copy. And so it's really heavily focused on using a very, very limited palette. Like I said, I will probably be offering it later on in the year as like a short workshop, an online workshop as well, but I don't have it filmed yet. But it's a great course. I taught the workshop multiple times, and everyone who's ever left the workshop says they use the color chart constantly. Even when they go back and expand their palette, they find themselves going back to that color chart to help them, understand flesh tones and that sort of thing. Okay, Stella, you said also the full underpainting and glazing. Did you have a question about that? And Colin, you said the chat will be available to play back. Yes, this whole session will be on my YouTube channel. So if you guys need to scrub back and rewatch, or you want to revisit this Q&A session, it'll be available just like the other critiques. It just might take like an hour for it to show up on YouTube because they have to render out in HD. So it might be available right away, but it might be really low resolution. So if you wait like an hour or two, it'll come back up and you can watch it in full HD. Beth, that is so true. It's funny because I've taught for a long time. I've been teaching for 9 years or so, and 8 years or something like that. Both in physical locations, and the online classes are kind of a new thing. But before that, I taught down in LA at several ateliers, and I even had my own. But it's really important. I would get people who come in and they say, I already know how to draw. I already know how to do this. And it's kind of funny because you might think you know how to draw, and you might have a way of drawing or painting a certain way. But the sooner you close yourself off, you're not going to grow as an artist. It's just, if you look at the best artists out there, they're constantly learning. If they have an opportunity to take a workshop, they take it. They surround themselves with artists who are excellent, and they're always pushing themselves. And I think it's so easy to get in your comfort zone and just repeat what you're doing. And that's the hardest part about having an independent practice where you're not studying, for example, under someone and you're just working in your studio every day. It's so easy to get stuck in a rut or not know how to move forward with your work. And one of the best ways I always say is shake it up and take a workshop. If you're feeling kind of stagnant in your practice and you feel like you're not growing or you're frustrated, you're hitting that plateau, try taking a workshop of something completely different than what you're used to doing. You'll have fun and you'll learn something. And you can take that into your practice, or you could just say, oh, that was an experience, whether it's a new medium or, it could be related to what you're doing, but maybe it's a different technique than what you use. So yeah, it's very true. You never really stop learning. I have a couple of artists I follow on Patreon who post their tutorials, and they work so different from me. They're more like alla prima, they're much looser, but there's so many things that I see that they do, and I'm like, that's really wonderful. I wonder how I could incorporate that into, my work. Yeah, the Zorn palette, Stella, it really does teach you on neighboring colors and how to create the illusion of different colors using a limited palette. Um, it is a great example of how you can place one color next to another and it will feel completely different than if you had placed it next to a different color on the palette. And it really relies on your understanding of color relationships in order to create the illusion that you want. So, for example, you place that ivory black with white and you get this gray. You place that next to an ultramarine blue and white and it's going to look gray. But you place that next in a limited palette of that Zoran palette, and then suddenly that is the blue, and it looks really blue. It can look as blue as the sky. You can paint landscapes with the Zoran palette. They're going to be more earthy, but yeah, you'll be surprised at how blue that really looks by comparison. Okay, so your question, I mentioned a class using that technique. Yes, so before this class, I don't know if I haven't posted the links yet. I know there were 2 people who had asked about my prior courses. So last year I had offered a underpainting class. It was just in tonal. It was a tonal painting class, so we did the full grisaille all the way to finish, and then we did glazes of color. If you're interested in that, Stella, send me an email, and I'll send you a link, and you can purchase it kind of as an independent study through my Gumroad, and I also actually have it on my site. It's just hidden right now because I'm thinking about running the course again probably later or next year. It kind of depends. I also have a charcoal course, portrait drawing. And I might run that one again. I'm not sure. I need to look at my schedule, but I might run that course again later. I know many of you took it before. It was the first course I offered. Okay, so let's see. Let me catch up here. Wait, I don't understand why someone is talking about Trump. Please leave my talk. This is not a political place. We are here to study art. So Raul Gunter, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're in my class or if you're just trolling my feed, but please leave. Thank you. Okay. Susan, let me catch up with your comment here. So after studying at an academy for 9 years, you find the online class fantastic. Well, thank you. I'm really glad. Yeah, you've been studying for quite a long time, the kind of atelier method. And it's funny because I never took a kind of a full-time atelier. I kind of pieced together my education. I studied at an atelier. They had a full-time program there, but I just did part-time. And I kind of jumped around and studied with different artists like Sean Cheatham, Aaron Westerberg, Ignat Ignatov. And a lot of those artists are more direct painters, more like alla prima. I studied site size there. But then I moved on and studied with Adrian for about a year in his atelier, which is in Los Angeles. He doesn't offer the full atelier anymore, but from that, I actually learned more of the indirect technique. Because a lot of the courses in the other classes at the other atelier, the LA Academy of Figurative Art, where I studied before that, they were so focused more on like a direct technique that there weren't too many classes offered where you can work on one painting over, several weeks. And we would do 10 weeks with the live model in Adrian's class and paint one pose that whole time. And we'd go through the process of doing the underpainting and the color study. And I never finished a painting in that class, even though I had an insane amount of time. Because I was learning, I never finished a painting. I felt like I got halfway done, And so the nice thing about the online class is that you can continue working even after we end our critiques, or you can go back and watch through. And I'm really grateful that the technology's kind of caught up in the sense that we can do things like this and continue you know, expanding the reach, because growing up, I was in such a small town that I didn't have access. Like the closest thing I had was the library, which had a few painting videos, and they had like one or two Richard Schmid books that I could borrow from a different nearby library, and that's how I studied. You know, art history books, master copies, whatever I could get my hands on. But I never had access to any formal training. And if I had had something like the online class, who knows what it would have done for me as a young artist. You know, I started painting when I was 16, kind of on my own. I took one oil painting class from a local artist here. He had no formal training, so the technique I learned was not very sound, but you know, it got me started. But I couldn't imagine the influence that this could have, you know, happened. And it's great that I can reach, you know, people from all over, because I feel like it kind of connects us better. You know, we all have different backgrounds, and you know, we live in different countries, but you know, we all have this love for, you know, figurative realism. So it's really cool. All right, so are there any other questions? This was really good. I'm glad you guys tuned in. I wasn't sure if anyone was just going to spend the day painting, trying to catch up. So just so you know, next week we will have a critique as usual, but don't stress about getting your full block in. Like, it doesn't have to be 100% done. If you can't get to the features, that's okay, because those videos are coming in a couple of days. So I wanted to space them out. It's kind of weird, and groups the next weeks 6 and 7 are going to be kind of similar. They're going to kind of be leaked out over time, and they're grouped so that you guys will have 2 weeks between critiques for 6 and 7 as well, so that you guys have plenty of time to work. I don't want you guys to rush. So, you know, I'm going to send you the lessons, and then you guys can work, you know, for 2 weeks on your painting, and then we'll have our critique. So just get it as far as you can by next weekend. Again, don't rush. So just, if it's just the large planes, then that's great. You know, just get it as far as you can. And those features videos are going to be coming. They are long. So I think the first one is 1 hour and 40 minutes, and I just painted one eye and the nose. So they just take longer because we're getting more into small shapes, and I'm a little more careful because I don't want to lose my drawing. So it takes a little bit longer, but those will be coming. And if you guys have questions before next weekend, post in the forum. And yeah, so that's it. All right, thank you guys. I'm glad you tuned in. And again, this will be available if you want to rewatch, or if you missed part of it. Just give it about an hour, and I'll post a link in our forum today for this video where you can go back and rewatch it. All right, thank you guys. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to seeing all of your work.